Welcome again, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sue Martin. Sue is a toxicology science director at the Dow Chemical Company based in the US. Sue is also a co-chair of the ECHA task force. So, Sue, over to you. Please turn on your camera, share your screen. The floor is yours.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes.
Perfect. So first, I want to thank my ECHA colleagues for giving me an opportunity to present an overview on our manuscript on developmental and reproductive toxicity, or DART, dose selection. So this is the agenda for the presentation today. I'd like to talk a little bit about our project goal. And as part of this, I'm going to review 2 recent publications on dose selection. So this will be ECHA's advice on dose setting for DART studies. And then a second publication that came out at roughly the same time frame from a group from the Netherlands, Van Berlo et al. And then I'll talk about the ECHA manuscript. This convened a group of DART experts, and we talked about points to consider when selecting DART dose levels. So we talked about animal welfare, body weight gain as a metric during gestation, some challenges with data interpretation if you dose too high, that developmental and reproductive toxicology studies, we want to look at more than just parental fertility. And then some other endpoints that we thought should be considered as part of DART dose selection. So I think it's important to emphasize that we all have the same goal when doing DART studies. We want to be able to protect public health. ECHA has a different approach to doing this, and that they're recommending the use of high dose levels to identify any potential DART hazards. But this raises some concerns. We're concerned that we may see effects that are secondary to maternal toxicity and not a direct response to the tested chemical. We may see an increase in animal suffering, and there may be a lack of human relevance for the adverse effects that are seen at these high dose levels. So this caused ECHA to convene a DART subject matter expert group to review the state of the science on dose setting in DART studies, as well as to make recommendations that consider the unique physiology of the maternal placental fetal. So as background to set the stage for this discussion, ECHA has been requesting higher top dose levels in mammalian toxicity studies, including DART studies. This facilitates hazard-based classification and labeling. They have also been advocating that current MTDs, so maximum tolerated dose metrics, like a 10% change in body weight, are not sufficient. And this is the perspective that has been supported by others like Van Berlo et al. Van Berlo correctly states that there is no universal definition for a maximum tolerated dose. And that's true if you look at the OECD test guidelines and guides documents. There are many different MTD proposals in those documents. Van Berlo also advocated that a typical MTD metric that we use, a 10% change in body weight, should only be used in carcinogenicity studies. Furthermore, the 10% change in body weight or body weight gain that is seen in other test guidelines, this should be removed from the test guidelines and guides documents for all other endpoints. Let me go into ECHA's dose guidance selection for DART studies in a little bit more detail. So ECHA reviewed extended 1-generation reproductive toxicity studies, so what I'll refer to as extended 1-gen studies. And they concluded that 20% did not have adequately high dose levels for EU regulatory purposes. So they offered guidance that said they wanted to see greater effects on parental generation to maximize the ability to detect hazards. And this came really basically around 2 main points. The first of which is that dose selection based solely on toxicokinetic considerations, so nonlinear toxicokinetics, is not allowed under REACH. And this is consistent, I think, with the guidance that we've been seeing from ECHA for the past several years. But then they went on that the highest dose level tested should aim to induce clear evidence of reproductive toxicity without excessive toxicity and severe suffering in parental animals. This resulted in ECHA convening this working group of DART subject matter experts to talk about the science of dose selection for DART studies. So here you can see that this group published a paper that was in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology in 2024. We also did some presentations at some scientific meetings. One of which will be a satellite workshop that was held at Eurotox, and my colleague Fiona will be talking more about that momentarily. We also have some sessions planned for this year, so we'll be doing a session at the 2025 Society of Toxicology meeting, as well as the European Environmental Mutagenesis and Genomics Society and the Eurotox meeting. Let me spend the next about 5 slides or so to give you a flavor of the high-level points that we captured as part of our consideration dose setting for DART studies. So the first point I'd like to get to is ECHA's advice on top dose selection for DART study argues that we should not induce severe suffering. This is a little bit of an eye chart. So this is an abridged version of Table 1 from the Lewis et al. Manuscript. And so I think this will be suitable for the points I want to make here, which is this column here on the left is ECHA's recent top dose selection advice for 2022. And what they say is that the aim is to use the highest possible dose level without severe suffering. But severe suffering is defined as prostration, severe inappetence, or excessive mortality greater than 10%. And this really isn't aligned in our view with what we see in other test guidelines for DART studies, as well as guidance documents, including guidance document 19 on humane endpoints, where it states that the highest dose level should not induce mortality or suffering in the animals as part of the study. Next thing I want to talk about is the proposal to remove the 10% change in body weight gain as an MTD criterion. We think that this is perhaps misplaced, not considering the unique physiology of pregnant animals. So this diagram here on the left, it shows maternal body weight across gestation for representative OECD 414 studies. So you can see the controls. You can see the body weight gain in pregnant animals. And so what we did was we set together a hypothetical example of a 10% decrease in gestation body weight. So you can see in this type of study design, the animals would have similar dose body weights across groups, starting at gestation day 6 when dosing occurred. And this would be the equivalent of a 10% decrease in body weight in those gestational animals. So this shows how this translates when you think about this in terms of maternal body weight gain. So here again, you can see our representative body weight gain in gestational animals. Again, all of them starting at a similar point on gestation day 6. The blue line shows the control group. This green line here would show a 10% decrease in gestational body weight gain. The orange line would be a 20% decrease in gestational body weight gain. And this red line, again, corresponding to the 10% decrease in gestational body weight, would be about a 25% decrease in gestational body weight gain. So this is important because in 2010, ECHA held a workshop with DART subject matter experts, and they reviewed what they thought was important about maternal toxicity. And while this group did not come to consensus on what constitutes a sufficient MTD in DART studies, they did all agree that a 20% decrease in gestational body weight gain for maternal animals was too much. That was too high. So that aligns with this orange line right here. So you can see that a 10% decrease in body weight would be too severe according to the ECHA workshop. Now I want to talk about a little bit about data interpretation challenges. So I think everyone who does DART studies recognizes that embryo-fetal development is contingent upon a healthy internal environment in the maternal animal. So if we induce excessive maternal toxicity by high dose levels, this can lead to a response in the embryo that isn't due to a direct effect of the toxicant. And in fact, it can make it difficult to interpret primary effects of the test material versus secondary non-specific effects that happen because of maternal overdosing. So we can't compromise the health of the maternal animal and expect that we will have good outcomes for the fetuses. So the other thing I wanted to mention in this study is that we also expect that DART studies are going to give us additional information aside from parental fertility. So as part of ECHA's recent advice on dose selection, they said that the top dose selection should induce clear evidence of reproductive toxicity in parental animals. And in fact, they go on to state that mortality of the pups is not considered for dose level selection. Dose levels should not be reduced to get enough offspring for the assessment of developmental toxicity. This is a little bit problematic because we also rely on DART studies to be able to evaluate offspring endpoints. Things like survival, development of the offspring, and the reproductive capacity of those animals that have been exposed during critical stages of development. So requiring effects on parental fertility at the top dose level increases the likelihood that we will have an insufficient number of pups to be able to adequately evaluate postnatal development as well as P2 or second generation reproductive toxicity. So as we decrease the number of offspring that we have to evaluate, we're going to limit the sensitivity of these studies. In addition, sometimes at the highest dose level, we may end up with such significant toxicity in the high dose group that we have to remove that dose group for animal welfare purposes. And then we can end up with an extended 1-gen or other DART studies where, in fact, we only have a control in 2 dose levels, which to be able to evaluate toxicity. And this, of course, will limit our ability to do more accurate dose response modeling. So the last point I have to make in this presentation is some of the other endpoints that we thought should be considered as part of DART dose selection. So the subject matter expert group decided that we really need to be thinking about the complex physiology of the maternal fetal unit. And I'm not going to go through all of these different points separately, but I did want to highlight a couple of them. So this idea of food consumption and nutritional intake. So we know that, for example, if there's a decrease in zinc levels within the dam or such significant tissue toxicity that we induce metallothionein expression in the dam, this can sequester zinc. We can end up with low levels of zinc in the dam, which subsequently result in low levels of zinc in the developing embryo. And this can itself result in malformations. So malformations in the fetus, secondary to effects we get on the dam. Another example of this would be maternal circulatory or cardiovascular effects. So if we reduce the amount of oxygen that's reaching the developing embryo, we may end up with fetal mortality, limb malformations, or cleft palate. So it's really, really important that we maintain the health of the dam in order for us to be able to adequately evaluate the primary effects of the test compound on DART dose selection. So that's all I have today. I'm going to turn it back to Lucy, and she can introduce herself.
Yeah, many thanks, Sue, for that succinct and informative overview highlighting the challenges of dose selection considerations in satisfying the requirements for such tests. Just a quick reminder of the Q&A session at the end. So please do paste your questions into the chat, into the Teams chat, and we'll get to them after the next presentation. So it is my pleasure to now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Fiona Sewell. Fiona is Head of Toxicology at NC3Rs, the National Centre for Replacement, Refinement and Reduction of Animals in Research, based in the UK. Fiona is a member of the ECHA task force, and her presentation will be focusing on developments since the task force publication last year, focusing on the EuroTox satellite workshop. Fiona, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you very much to Sue for a great summary of the ECHA paper and the work we've been doing around this as part of the task force, highlighting your concerns and complexities related to dose level selection for DART studies. So as Lucy said, I'm going to cover some highlights from the EuroTox satellite event that we held on this topic last year that I'm sure some of you hopefully attended. So I'm going to cover how the workshop arose and some of the outputs from this event. So we've already heard the advice issued by ECHA on dose level selection. For DART, it's driven much discussion and debate within the scientific community. I think it's fair to say there have been a range of different reactions to this. There are concerns around the implications that this has for animal welfare and the potential for dosing at unnecessarily high doses. So a number of expert groups, including the ECHA task force, that you've already heard about from Sue. We have considered this advice and resulted in our publication that Sue covered, addressing the concerns and providing some of our considerations for dose level selection. So this publication came out about this time last year, and there have been others as well, including a publication that came out of the HESI Dark group that I've also got a screenshot from, which also highlighted concerns relating to animal welfare and the potential for this advice to push dosing higher. Sorry, Ingo, Manon, Daphne, if you're on the line, I didn't warn you that I was going to show your photos, but these are the workshop organisers. So about the time of these publications, I was at SOT, at the SOT meeting in Salt Lake City in the US, and I met with Manon, who was involved in the HESI publication. And following a number of discussions, this led Manon to approach Ingo Vishwaya from ECHA, and his colleagues to see if we could work together. Given sort of the response to this advice, we could get together to get a better understanding of the advice and how and why it came about and the intentions around it. And actually, when we began discussing together in that small group, and after hearing more from ECHA about some of the examples and the real data that the advice has been written around, we had what we called our light bulb moment, where we had a realization that perhaps we weren't maybe quite as far away as we first thought we were. And that whilst we were all reading the same advice, we were actually coming at it from different angles and different perspectives. Our different perspectives, we were different because we didn't quite have the same background or understanding or information on how or why the advice had come about. And so by talking together, we had a better understanding of the intentions. And from ECHA's perspective, we were told that there was some surprise at the response to the advice when it was issued. In fact, there didn't necessarily need to be such a big shift or change in approach because the majority were dosing correctly, but there were some clear cases and examples that had driven the advice document and did need to be addressed. So there was overall agreement that we were, as Sue said, ultimately working towards the same goal to ensure human health protection. But we thought it'd be useful to get together to have a better understanding of the different interpretations and perspectives around the advice. So this is where the idea for the workshop came about. We wanted to expand the discussions that we've been having to others to provide the background that ECHA had at the time of writing the advice and to try and bring those perspectives closer together. So the aim of the workshop was to have that better understanding, to help inform decisions around dose selection, to understand, how the ECHA advice had originated, but also to understand and demonstrate how it had been interpreted and the implications that the different interpretations had in terms of dose decision making, in dose selection, and in terms of animal use and welfare. So the intention was that discussions at this workshop would help inform a written update of the ECHA advice to help provide clarity on the advice and ensure that it is clear for everyone. So at relatively short notice, we managed to organise a satellite event at the Eurotox meeting in Copenhagen in September last year. So we had support from ECHA, from Charles River, and from my organisation, the NC3Rs. It was, given the topic, an extremely popular event, and we had many more attend than we originally expected, with well over 100 stakeholders attending on the day. We had to have a last-minute room change. So Ingo provided an overview of the purpose of DART studies and the ECHA advice and the ERGOT review that Sue's already mentioned, and expanded on some of the examples that the advice was developed and based on. But the majority of the workshop session included an interactive element. We used a voting software to go through the advice in detail to highlight how certain sections had been interpreted, to understand how they've been interpreted, to try and identify areas that would be in need of clarification. So this word cloud shows sort of one of the test questions that we used with the voting system, just to see where everyone was from. You can see they had very wide representation from all over the world. A summary of the discussions has been written up as a workshop report. This was published in November last year. So for today, I've just pulled out a few of the key points to highlight and that was discussed at this workshop, to hopefully stimulate some more discussion in the Q&A later in today's webinar. But first, I wanted just to show you a couple of these voting questions to show you that audience members that answered my questions, we had a mixed and very relevant audience in terms of regulatory, industry, test, laboratory and academic representation, and the majority of responders did actually have experience in commissioning and conducting or interpreting DART studies themselves. So I'm just pulling out a few of the key discussion topics for today. So as Sue's already mentioned, one of ECHA's and others' main criticisms of the ECHA advice is that it doesn't seem to align with the OECD test guidelines or with humane endpoint guidance. So I've just pulled out an extract from the guidance here that I think was also, bits of it were in Sue's talk. So we presented this as an area that would benefit from further clarification, particularly with the implications of some of the wording that I've highlighted here. So irrespective of the specifications in the OECD test guidelines, it's critical that tested doses are sufficiently high to conclude on a lack of clear evidence on reprotox properties warranting classification as a Repro 1B. So there was a lot of discussion around what might constitute sufficiently high, and talking about the ambiguity around some of the wording, particularly in terms of what would warrant a Repro 1B classification. So we used the voting system to ask the audience if they felt this was an area that would require some clarification if there were to be an update to the ECHA advice, and almost 90% of responding audience members agreed that this is an area where, in terms of the wording, it would be useful to have some clarification. And on the day, there was agreement also from ECHA on this point. It was made clear to us by Ingo that there was no intention to disregard what was set out in the OECD test guidelines, and that these are all points that will be looked at in more detail in terms of a planned update to the advice. Similarly, there was extensive discussion around wording related to the highest dose level selection and the intention of and implications of the wording in the advice, that it should be the highest possible dose level without severe suffering or death. So again, there was concern around the ambiguity around this wording, and that subjectivity could lead to differences in interpretation between laboratories, but also from ECHA themselves. And it was unclear how it should be proved that the selected dose was as high as possible. So again, we polled the audience on this point to understand how the as high as possible have been interpreted, and well over half of the audience members that answered said that they understood this to be a requirement to demonstrate, to show severe signs and death in a dose range finding study, with a smaller proportion taking this to mean demonstration of lower maternal body weight gain of 10 to 15%. And we've heard from Sue about the discussions around body weight gain and body weight loss as well. So there was quite a lot of discussion around this. So following on from this discussion on the day, ECHA indicated that it's not necessary to identify the dose at which death will occur, and they will also consider providing further clarification on this point. So related to this same part of the guidance, one of the key topics was also dose spacing. And I believe this was also covered at an ECHA CRO day that was held in November last year. There was concern that the dose spacing as outlined in the OECD test guidelines for DART studies, so again, relating to alignment of the advice with OECD test guidelines, so this 2 to 4-fold that is outlined in the guidance, in the test guidelines, may not be accepted if the NOAL was unclear. So there was questions around whether, for example, if the high dose was selected as 2 to 4 folds lower than the level causing death or severe suffering, would this be acceptable? Another question was raised whether, if mortality was seen at 1,000 mg per kilogram, but there's no severe signs at 500, would another dose range finding study be required? So there was extensive discussion around this. ECHA indicated that as per the OECD test guidelines, 2 to 4-fold or more likely 2 to 3 would be acceptable, especially in the case here where there is that steep dose curve, but that generally it's difficult for them to provide an exact rule book and guidance, and so a weighted evidence approach is required that would be based on the whole data set on a case-by-case basis, involving study director justification. So of course, we recognise that case-by-case approach doesn't necessarily provide that useful concrete guidance that can give confidence in the decision-making in practice. This would require input judgment from ECHA, But ECHA did say that they will consider, again, this is another area they will consider providing further clarification on, particularly in terms of the alignment with the OECD test guidelines around the dose spacing. But it was also accompanied by a clear request from ECHA that all data is provided to them to help with their understanding of the study-directed decision-making, but also to help inform their own decision-making as well. So now on to my sort of last key point that I'm going to cover today, and Sue already touched on this. And this was around ECHA's priority for the extended 1Gen, so the 443, to focus on sexual function and fertility. So we discussed one of the examples that is in the ECHA advice document. I've included an extract on the screen here. So they're looking at an example where there was a developmental effect, so post-implantation loss, and the advice to self-classify as a repro 1B. So in this example, there's a 4-week and a 90-day tox study, the 407 and 408, that are clean with no toxicity at the 1,000 mg per kilogram. So then went on to the repro screen, the 422, at standard dosing of sort of 100, 300 and 1,000 mg per kilogram. So here a dose-related increase in post-implantation loss was seen, which resulted in no PUPs at the high dose. So the substance was classified as a repro 1B. So we asked the audience, I think this was our last question on the day, we asked the audience if in this situation they would still proceed with the extended 1Gen. And the majority answered that no. So 2/3 said no, they didn't think they would. However, on further discussion, it was concluded that actually the 443 would still be required in this case because the facility still needs to be assessed. So despite there being no PUPs, as there was no parental tox in the 407 or the 408 or effects on sexual function and fertility in the 422. So in this case, and I think outlined in the ECHA advice, is that the 443 should be assessed with a high dose of the 1,000 mg per kilogram, even though this would result in no PUPs at that dose level. So yeah, as we've heard, the focus of ECHA's focus on the sexual function and fertility with reduced emphasis on the developmental effects is another sort of topic that has raised concerns. And yes, Sue did mention that at the end of her talk, especially where it is expected to result in the lower number of PUPs, but also around the implications this may have for other authorities and sort of national legislations as well. So it was agreed by ECHA that it might not seem logical to proceed with the 443 when there is that clear repro 1 decision based on insufficient offspring, but this is still a current regulatory requirement by law, and so not to do so would require change to the legislation, which is beyond the scope of the guidance advice. So I've just quickly gone over some of the key points that were discussed at the workshop. There is a workshop report that I put the link on the slide here, and I'm happy to share the slides, which goes into these and other points in more detail. I'm also happy to, the slides are available on request. So please do let me know if you'd like a copy of the slides as well. That will include presentation from ECHA and the results of all the voting questions. In summary, there were very productive discussions, and there was acknowledgement from ECHA of the areas that do require clarification. There was agreement to do so, along with that request that all data is provided and clear justifications made behind the decisions on dose selection. So following on from the workshop, I know there have been continuing discussions, so including the CRO day that ECHA hosted themselves in November. I believe ECHA are considering an update to the advice and are working this at the moment. I think our perspectives are now closer together. There is a better understanding of the intentions and interpretations of the advice. We all working to the same goal, but there are some areas where further discussion and clarification would be beneficial, particularly applying to the points that I've covered today in my talk and what Sue covered around the ECHA publication, particularly around what constitutes severe suffering, the high dose level selection, dose spacing, and the clarity around reproductive function versus litter endpoints. So, and I think until there are written updates to the advice on some of these points, there is still a lot of uncertainty around the requirements and how they apply to decisions around dose dose selection and dose spacing. And so we'll be continuing the discussions to hopefully help feed into a written update of the advice that is useful and provides the clarity that is needed. And so we would welcome further discussion on this. So happy to talk through any concerns and take questions in the Q&A. And as Sue's already highlighted, we are very much trying to keep this topic of discussion open. So we've got a number of sessions at conferences coming up over the rest of the year, including at SOT in a couple of weeks. And myself, Ingo from ECHA, and Manon from Charles River will be running a session at Neurotox in September. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts and comments on this. Stop sharing.
Well, thank you very, very much, Fiona, and thank you, Sue. And yes, I'm Phil Botham. So I'm from Syngenta, but I was one of the two stewards from the ECHA Scientific Committee for the ECHA task force that put together the publication that you've just been hearing about. I think it's important to recognise that this is still very much an open discussion. And I would like to thank not only my colleagues from ECHA, but also colleagues from ECHA as well, who have been very willing to continue to engage in these discussions. And as you've heard, I've got every intention to increase some of the transparency and perhaps confusion that surrounded some of the points that are made in their advice document from 2022. It probably, and indeed almost certainly, will not answer all the questions that we have. And that's why it will still be a live topic, I think, for many of us. And that balance between the legislative needs to identify hazard and to therefore do toxicologist testing, at least in Europe, at pretty high dose levels, versus the impact that has on the identification of, or the problem of finding effects which are simply due to overdosing, and the implications that may in turn have for the same compound that's being registered outside of Europe, together with the animal welfare considerations, of course, which concern many of us. I think that you can see, all of us, that why this will need to be continue to be a live topic. And so I'd like to thank all of you for joining today, and I hope that you will continue to stay in touch with this as it's discussed further, as Fiona has mentioned, in various ways this year. Next stop is the SOT meeting in March of this year, and we look forward also to hearing more back from our colleagues at ECHA. So thank you all for your time today, and I hope that you found that a very helpful webinar. We hope also that you have enjoyed reading not only our paper, and if you haven't done so, there's you can always find a link to that, I'm sure, from the ECHA website. In turn, I hope to see some or all of you in scientific meetings later in the year. So thank you once again, and thanks for those who organised this.
Many thanks, everyone.